This is the follow-up to my 2012 report on fracking. We discovered during that first investigation that many of the concerns about fracking were not about fracking itself, but about the expansion of the industry that fracking enables. So in that interim report, we looked at the environmental impacts associated with oil and gas wells from their birth to their death, from the establishing the well site to abandoning the well, with fracking just one brief stage. My conclusion was that the environmental impacts could be managed effectively provided, to quote the Royal Society of London, best practices are implemented and enforced through regulation. I then undertook to come back and look at the government oversight and regulation, which is what I've done in this report being released today. Because what we see overseas is regulators struggling to keep up with an industry that has in some places expanded very rapidly, and expansion largely enabled by fracking. So are we likely to find ourselves in the same situation here? I want to make it clear I'm not dealing with any aspects of offshore drilling in this report. This is just about drilling on land. And also, of course, the really big problem that sits behind all of this is climate change. But this report is focused on the local and regional impacts of oil and gas drilling. But there is a short piece on climate change at the end of the report, and I will make some comments at the end of my presentation. We've had an oil and gas industry in New Zealand for a long time. This photo was taken in 1959, and these are the men who drilled the first well at Kapuni. But now we have this new technology called hydraulic fracturing, shortened to the catchier fracking. There's opposition in many countries. Currently there are moratoria in 17 countries or states, including Victoria in Australia. And in Australia, farmers have joined environmentalists in opposing fracking, and this photo is outside the Queensland Parliament. What is fracking? Just a brief revision. Fracking fluid is sent down a well at high pressure, that's the red. It creates cracks in the rock. The oil and gas trapped in the rock can then flow out, that's the black. Some of the fracking fluid comes back, that's the red again. And a large amount of water, in the blue, comes out with the oil and gas deep from below the ground over the life of the well, and that's what is known as produced water, presumably because it's produced along with the oil and gas. There are three kinds of fracking to consider in New Zealand: tight sands, shale and coal seam gas. And as I've got a slide showing each of these, this is a well site in Taranaki. In Taranaki, oil and gas are extracted out of sandstone. When that sandstone is relatively impermeable, it's referred to as tight. Some fracking has been done in Taranaki for over 20 years to crack some of the tight sandstones, but compared with much of the fracking done elsewhere, it's fracking light. This is an exploration well being drilled near Dannevirke. Fracking might enable the spread of oil and gas drilling to this part of the country, the East Coast Basin, where we're not dealing with sandstone, we're dealing with shale, and this is much more comparable to what is going on in North America. And then the third kind is fracking coal seams, to get the methane gas that's in there out. A lot of this going on in Australia, concern there about not only contamination of aquifers, but the drawdown of aquifers, lowering the level of groundwater. This could be a problem if we start to do coal seam gas extraction in some parts of the country, such as Canterbury. At the end of the first report, in the interim report, I said there were 4 things we needed to get right to effectively manage the environmental impacts. And I'll just let you read those there, I don't need to read them out to you. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, and the first is the most challenging in our current system. So the first thing to get right is watch where you drill. And it's one of the International Energy Agency's golden rules. More generally, I want to say that the judgments in this report are based on guidelines and best practice that we have gleaned from a number of significant international reviews. The IEA's Golden Rules is just one of those reports. But so watching where you drill. Where does drilling take place? It starts with a block offers from New Zealand Petroleum and Minerals. This map shows the blocks where companies already have permits for drilling in the grey, and the blocks being offered this year are in red. So this year, companies can bid for permits to drill in the red areas. If you own some land in one of these areas, You cannot stop a well being drilled on your land because the Crown owns the oil and the gas, not you. That can be a bit of a shock to people. The only consideration in granting these permits is the economic value of the oil and gas that could be extracted. That's in law. If you are concerned about the impacts on the environment or on the people living nearby, you need to turn to councils and the RMA. So we looked first at regional council plans, and we find that in most parts of the country there is no distinction drawn in those plans between a well that is drilled for oil and gas and a well that is drilled for water. What's more, in most of the country, a council can't say no to a well being drilled, though it can put conditions on it. We hear about resource consents being required for trivial things like extending a deck, but at the other end of the spectrum, you can drill an oil and gas well in Taranaki without a resource consent. You can see in this map that permits for drilling are clustered in 3 parts of the country: Taranaki, in the South Island where there are coal seams, and in the east of the North Island where there is shale. The area where there is shale is known as the East Coast Basin. Much of it actually is in the sea, but it is much of Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Manawatu, Wairarapa. TAG Oil is drilling exploration wells in the East Coast Basin. It's looking for oil, and it sees the East Coast Basin as comparable to 2 areas in the United States: the Bakken oil field in North Dakota and the Eagle Ford oil field in Texas. This is a satellite image taken at night of part of the United States. You can see the cities of Chicago, of Minneapolis, and then you see up on the left the Bakken oil field. That light is gas being flared. The intensity and extent of the light gives a sense of the number of wells and of the amount of gas being flared. It's like another big city. This is a photo of the second shale field that the East Coast Basin has been compared to, Eagle Ford, and you can see how close together the wells can be. You can get as many as 1 well every square kilometre and end up with a pock-marked landscape. And this is Eagle Ford again from Google Earth. You can see the change that occurs over 4 years. It's the speed of this change that has led to the reaction overseas, and there is nothing in place that would stop such a rapid expansion here. And this really is a story about cumulative effects. A single well is no big deal, maybe to people next to it, but if it has been properly located and constructed. But the cumulative effects of many wells is a big deal. The company that is drilling exploration wells in the East Coast Basin is spending millions of dollars looking for oil. They are after a big prize, and councils have limited their own power to say that's enough. It has always been very difficult to deal with cumulative effects under the RMA. It is harder to get permission for the first straw than the straw that breaks the camel's back because of all the precedents that are set. But government and councils do have tools under the RMA to get ahead of the game and should use them. I've made 6 recommendations in the report. The first 2 are connected and in large part are aimed at dealing with this high-level problem of potentially rapid expansion, as well as the lack of public involvement in the decision-making. The first recommendation is for the government to produce what's called a national policy statement, which councils would have to incorporate into their plans. And the second one is about the revision of plans that many regional councils are currently doing. And some of the things that should be included in them, the same things that I would like to see in a national policy statement. Those things include making drilling an oil and gas well a discretionary activity, so councils can actually say no to the straw that breaks the camel's back, and being explicit about when applications for consents will be publicly notified and when they will not be. So those are my first 2 recommendations. Moving on to the third one. Another very important thing to get right is what's known as the integrity of the well, which has nothing to do with its ethics, but making sure that it doesn't leak. If it's a very fast leak, you get a blowout, like the one shown there, in an old coal seam gas well near Greymouth. Actually, that was an old well, it wasn't fracked, still got the methane out. But there's a big overlap with the health and safety of the employees at well sites with looking after the environment. And you can see, if you look carefully in that photo, one of the workers at the site running away with the blowout occurring. Last year, the government made some very good changes to the health and safety regulations that also go a long way towards protecting the environment, because they improve the integrity of the well, make leaks less likely. But there is one gap, which is the subject of my third recommendation. Wells are cased in layers of steel and cement. We need to make sure that the well casing is adequate when the well passes through a fresh water layer. This is an environmental matter that is not captured in the safety regulations. So that's the gap I was referring to that needs to be plugged. My fourth recommendation is about liability for when things go wrong. This leak was discovered by a local farmer. We need to ensure that companies have adequate insurance for cleanups, because stuff does happen. Abandoned wells are a particular problem, and there's many of them. In the long term, all wells will leak because the cement weakens. Under current law, the liability for that falls on the landowner, and the company may be long gone. And there's no monitoring of the environment around abandoned wells, which you need to do to find leaks. In Canada, they have a system where companies pay levies into a fund that can then be used for monitoring and for cleaning up any leaks that occur. So that's this liability issue is the subject of my fourth recommendation. Going on to the fifth one, people worry about the risks of fracking fluid, but the components of fracking fluid are only temporarily on a well site. There are tanks of many other hazardous substances stored at well sites, for example diesel. And the fifth recommendation is about these hazardous substances, because spills and leaks can cause trouble. And there is a particular problem with the enforcement of hazardous substances regulations. I'm recommending that that enforcement be done by regional council staff when they visit well sites to check compliance with their own conditions and recover the costs from companies. This is just basic efficiency, and user pays. Now I want to move to my last recommendation, which is a subject of dealing with waste. Two kinds of waste: liquid waste and solid waste. Waste from the exploration wells in the East Coast Basin is being trucked to Taranaki so far. Liquid waste is being injected deep underground in Taranaki in wells drilled for this purpose, like the one in this picture. We found no problems with this. But solid waste is another story. Most solid waste in Taranaki is now land farmed, which is not a helpful term since most farming takes place on land. But what it means is this. The solid waste they have to deal with is mostly drill cuttings, bits of rock with some contaminants stuck onto it, drilling muds as they're known, hydrocarbons, heavy metals. A slurry of this waste is spread out on a paddock mixed with topsoil, and the microbes in the soil will break down the hydrocarbons over time. In addition, limits are put on contaminants like heavy metals that don't break down. The mix of the waste slurry and the topsoil is fertilised and pasture is sown. But there's one problem, and that is that in the resource consents for this land farming, there is no stand-down period for livestock. And the story, of course, broke last August when Fonterra said it is not going to take milk from any more than the 6 land farms to which it is already contracted. So my last recommendation is concerned with solid waste. So there's an immediate problem that needs fixing here. This is a paddock which has recently had waste put on it. Regardless of the real risk, it's not a good look. But beyond this, how would the waste be disposed of in the East Coast Basin? It's worth noting that in New South Wales, land farming is prohibited. They use the drill cuttings there for road fill. I want to go back to the Bakken oil field. One of the 2 areas in the United States where the shale has been compared to the shale of the East Coast Basin, and talk about it briefly in relation to climate change. We hear a lot about gas being a transition fuel to a low-carbon world. That can certainly be the case where it substitutes for coal, but its potential as a transition fuel is very limited in New Zealand because we burn relatively little coal. But this photo shows one thing that I'm very concerned about. All that light at the Bakken oil field is gas being burned off, going to waste. It's not acting as a transition fuel there. The oil is far more valuable, and there's not the demand for the gas to make it worthwhile to invest in the infrastructure needed to put it to good use. There are restrictions on the flaring of gas in New Zealand, but if we see oil wells multiplying in the East Coast Basin, there could be big pressure on those flaring rules, and the emissions trading scheme in its current form would do nothing to stop it. In summary, there are some problems with the way things are being done now that need to be fixed, but beyond that, and perhaps more importantly, we need to be prepared for an expansion of the industry that could occur and could be relatively rapid. Exploration wells are now being drilled in the East Coast Basin, hoping for the prize of oil, and we may also soon see coal seams being drilled and fracked to release the methane. We do have laws in place that can be used to prepare for such a future, but we need to do this thinking and planning now. The experience overseas has been one of regulators scrambling to catch up. We need to get ahead of the game here, and we have an opportunity. So thank you very much for listening, and now I'll take questions.
Did you consider a moratorium?
Yes. I judged that the laws we have in place, there needed to be some tweaking and some action, but that they were adequate to deal with the problem, and we had time to do that. We've also had the advantage of learning from what's gone wrong overseas. So we know that if we have coal seam gas wells, we need to be prepared for modelling aquifer drawdown, some instances, things like that. We've learnt from the United States that monitoring is very important. So we do have that knowledge now, but we do need to act nonetheless. But a moratorium is not justified in my view.
How bad does it have to get before one becomes a serious option?
I'm just looking forward to the government responding to my recommendations.
They have just put out a response saying they'll consider it, but basically saying that everything they've already got is good enough.
Well, I disagree. But we shall see what unfolds.
Why do you disagree?
Well, for all the reasons that are explained in the report. I mean, the recommendations are all soundly based, gone through all the information, and the case for them is made in the report. So I would like to think that government is not doing a too fast response here and will take the time to think about it.
What are your biggest concerns if they don't take your recommendations?
I suppose my single biggest concern is that we would see a repetition of the multiplying of wells in the East Coast Basin in the first instance, and potentially coal seam gas wells elsewhere, without the ability to really control that. And that's what's happened overseas. It's been the rapidity of that has taken regulators by surprise.
Of your 6 recommendations, is there one that you prioritise that you want the government to take heed?
Well, I think the last 4, which are very specific, are quite easy for them to do. So I'd be very disappointed if they didn't do those, and they're quite practical things. The first 2, which are linked together, are the ones that are aimed at dealing with that high-level problem of the rapid expansion. So, of course, that's what I consider to be the most important, but I would like to see the other things done well. You have to take care of those things as well.
Say the government did implement all of these recommendations, would you be happy to see fracking in New Zealand?
I would be, as I've said in the report, of course I would prefer to see greener growth. With my role as Environment Commissioner, that's an obvious thing. My biggest concern in this role is climate change, but this report is about the local and regional effects. I've been vocal on climate change in other aspects. There's no direct connection really between the oil that we extract in this country and the oil that we use. What we need is good strong carbon price, and we need a plan for meeting our commitment to a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, because we do not have a plan to do that.
Jan Lee, back to the issue around the moratorium, or in fact a call for one. We've already got four wells consented within the East Coast Basin,
yes.
And there's 2 more in application.
Yep.
And in theory, we could have a lot more. If things work, you know, for tag oil, for example, they could be applying for a lot more in the next few months. You know, it takes at least, I think, a year, 18 months to get a national policy statement through the process.
Yes.
A lot could happen in that time. We could actually be where they are in Bracken in that time. So again, I just question this idea that that not calling for a moratorium
Yeah.
for the interim,
Yeah.
given things could change so rapidly, as you say, is a good move.
I think maybe my sense of it wouldn't happen quite so rapidly here because we do have more checks and balances in place. I think it could happen in 5 to 10 years rather than quite as fast over there. I find it rather difficult to call for a moratorium on something where there is a risk. When you look at what are the environmental risks? The environmental risks are primarily its contamination of groundwater would be the one that would be the most. If a well is properly designed and constructed, those risks, and located well, those risks are not high. So if we put aside climate change, I would find it difficult to call for a moratorium on that when I'm not calling for a moratorium on other economic activities that we know are doing major damage to the water quality in this country. So, it's a matter of keeping things in perspective.
Other things like what?
My last report on the nitrogen getting into water, particularly from the expansion of dairy farming.
You look at all that emissions from wells. I know there's been a lot of different figures and debate about that in the US.
Yes.
Were there any recommendations or advice on that?
Yes, we have looked at those numbers. They seem to be very location specific. I'm concerned that when coal is mined, there's a lot of methane also that escapes from the ground. So you've always got to think of what is the comparison here. Given that gas has half the carbon footprint of coal in combustion and sometimes a third if you're burning it in a particular kind of electric power plant, it seems to me you would have to have an awful lot of fugitive emissions to get over that problem. So, but it's an active area of research worldwide.
If I could bring you back to that question,
sure.
It's on page 8.
Yes.
It's regarding the government committing to reducing greenhouse gases, and you seem to be increasingly hearing that it's pointless for our small country to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases because our contribution to the global total is insignificant.
Yes.
Why did you mention that in this report on fracking?
Because I was a bit tired of hearing that line, I suppose. Yes, I've heard it. I didn't associate it particularly with that minister, but I hear it repeatedly. New Zealand is so small, why should we bother? But the problem of climate change is a problem of collective action, and every bit of that is small in itself. And there is no hope for doing anything about it unless small as well as big countries commit.
Thank you for today and for the report. The government recently released some guidelines, and I wondered if you could perhaps comment on those guidelines and perhaps some of the challenges that they pose with respect to the recommendations that you've made.
Yes, those guidelines are a very useful document because they have a lot of information in them and a lot of very good description of what is going on. But primarily what they do is describe how things are done now and give very little in the way of guidance on how things could be done better. And that, I think, is a consequence of the report, the information and the reports being written by consultants and council staff. And it's quite a big ask for council staff to say that their councils are doing anything wrong. So I think that's perhaps what's useful in itself, but I would like to see a national policy statement developed because that would be one way in which the public could be engaged. And one of the things that is of quite concern here, I mean, we're looking at what is potentially could be a very big transformation of our countryside, and there is no, apart from the consultation that goes on when plans are developed, that seems to pass a lot of the public by anyway. None of the applications for consent have been publicly notified. So I do understand why people feel frustrated and excluded. This is not a heavy industry that sits tidily in an industrial park on the edge of New Plymouth. In Taranaki it pops up on well sites when there's as many as 10 wells, but potentially, and I only say potentially, on the East Coast Basin, the wells could just pop up, they're separated by a kilometre or so. So it's quite a different kind of development.
I'd just like you to talk a little bit more about the integrity of wells. I think if we could be assured that wells would hold their integrity and not leak, that may put a lot of minds at rest. However, I understand expert engineers say that it's physically impossible to ensure that a well will not leak, and that the industry and open source information finds it acceptable, but that 5 to 8% of wells will leak on completion. That's brand new wells, and that percentage will go up as the well gets older. Is there any method that you know of that is going to ensure that wells will be keep their integrity?
Yeah, I think one development that is very good is that in the wake of Pike River, the government established the High Hazard Unit, which deals with oil and gas, with coal and with geothermal, there are probably men, in that unit who are very highly trained from overseas. So I think the level of expertise within New Zealand in the inspectors who are checking these things has gone up a lot. I think that as I said before, the one gap we have here is when the well passes through a freshwater layer. At the moment, those inspectors have no mandate to actually ensure that the well is adequately cased at that point. That doesn't mean to say they're not being adequately cased, but it's a question of who's got the responsibility to make sure they are. But you're right, as I said, with the abandoned wells, over time wells sort of eventually leak, but with abandoned wells, I guess one thing is that there's not the volume of hydrocarbons in them because most of it's been extracted, so the damage is perhaps more limited. But again, there may be, and I think there very likely should be, the exclusion of some areas where wells should not be drilled at all. The Tonga Aquifer in Hawke's Bay is one such place. If you go across, in fact, the East Coast Basin, it's drier, it's more reliant on a few key aquifers, and those become very important. And so it simply may be unacceptable for that for wells to be drilled in that area. An important point is that under the Crown Minerals Act they can be, because the only thing that matters is the economic value of the oil and gas. Therefore it falls to councils to get ahead of that and make sure they exclude those areas in their plans.